Los Angeles was the city of dreams, but for some, it was a nightmare they never woke up from. In the forgotten corners of South Central, black women vanished without a trace, only to be found dumped in alleyways, discarded like trash. The news barely made a headline. The police hesitated, and the killer was patient, calculated, moving unnoticed in plain sight. Then, the killings stopped. Just like that, for over a decade, the streets grew quiet again. No more bodies, no more headlines. It was as if the predator had simply disappeared. But monsters don't just stop, do they? Because years later, when everyone had stopped looking, he came back. The bodies kept turning up, strangled, stabbed, discarded like yesterday's trash in South Los Angeles. The police knew something was wrong, that someone was out there hunting women. But for years, they looked the other way. As headlines obsessed over the wealthy victims of Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, who had California for almost a year, the women of South Central were forgotten. No citywide panic, no task force mobilized overnight. These women were poor, black sex workers or drug users. Society had already decided their fate. Even as protests erupted outside LAPD headquarters demanding action, the killings continued. By 1986, the case had spiraled into confusion. Too many victims, too many killers. The so-called Southside Slayer task force began to shrink, and eventually the investigations faded into silence. The city moved on. For years, the murders in South Los Angeles were blamed on a faceless predator the city barely acknowledged. But as investigators struggled to make sense of the bodies piling up, they began to realize the unthinkable. This wasn't the work of one man. It was worse. Too many victims, too many patterns. The so-called Southside Slayer was a myth, an easy label for a problem no one wanted to solve. But the truth was, there were multiple killers, each lurking in the same hunting grounds, preying on the same forgotten women. Some were caught, others faded into the background, their crimes lost in a sea of indifference, and one of them was hiding in plain sight. He was a former city worker, a husband, a father. He shared beers with neighbors, cracked jokes at backyard barbecues, and even helped fix cars on his block. To those who knew him, he was just Lonnie. But behind closed doors, he was an entirely different person, a monster to say the least. Lonnie Franklin Jr. blended in as a father, a husband, a neighbor, someone you'd pass on the street and say hello to, without even a thought of them being harmful to you. But beneath the facade was a man who hid his monstrosity behind the mask of a normal person. And you know what men driven by an uncontrollable need for dominance do? They prey on those who are defenseless, the ones who are the vulnerable populations of society. His darkness wasn't new. It had been there for decades. In 1974, while stationed in Stuttgart, West Germany, Franklin and two fellow servicemen tricked a 17-year-old girl into their car. She thought she was helping them. Instead, they took her to a remote location and subjected her to an ordeal she would never forget. They essayed her for several hours. However, Franklin made a mistake. The girl, thinking quickly, pretended to be interested in him, asking for his phone number. Franklin, arrogant and overconfident, gave it to her. That single misstep led to his arrest. By 1975, he was dishonorably discharged from the U.S. Army after serving time for the crime. But back in South Central Los Angeles, he picked up where he left off. More arrests followed: theft, assault, battery. He spent time behind bars, but never long enough. Every time he walked free, blending back into the world like nothing had happened. And outside of a jail cell, Lonnie Franklin Jr. had something even more dangerous than freedom. He had opportunity. By the 1980s, Los Angeles was deep in crime, addiction, and neglect of its citizens. Entire communities were suffering, and many women, especially those already struggling with poverty or substance use, were left vulnerable. Some disappeared. Some were later found discarded in alleys and abandoned lots. But many were simply never seen again. Even then, authorities took little notice. There were no urgent warnings, no relentless investigations. To them, these were just unfortunate statistics in a city already overwhelmed with violence. But Franklin noticed, and in the shadows of a city in chaos, he took full advantage. For years, he continued being the monster that he was, living a normal life by day and submitting to his darkest urges by night. He was a husband, a father, a mechanic, a friendly face on the block. No one suspected a thing. But eventually, the world would come to know the real Lonnie Franklin Jr. And when they did, they would be horrified. By the mid-1980s, fear had settled over South Central Los Angeles like a thick, suffocating fog. Women, black women, marginalized women, women no one seemed to care about, were disappearing. Their bodies later turned up in dumpsters, alleys, and vacant lots, their lives erased without so much as a headline. Whispers spread through the streets. There was a killer among them. The police had a name: the Southside Slayer, a faceless predator believed to be responsible for at least 13 murders between 2 years, 1983 and 1985. The victims were women who had fallen through society's cracks, many battling addiction, many forced into sex work just to survive. The newspapers called the crimes the Strawberry Murders, after the slang term for women who exchanged sex for drugs. But in the halls of the LAPD, there was no urgency, no citywide warnings, no dedicated task force. Until September 1985. That's when the LAPD finally held a press conference acknowledging what the community had already known for years. Someone was hunting women in South Central. They pleaded for tips. They promised to investigate. But for many it was too little, too late. And no one was angrier than Margaret Prescott. She and other activists stood outside police headquarters week after week, demanding action. They called out the department's failure to warn the community sooner. They pointed out the unbelievably unfair difference between this case and the one that was all over the news, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. That investigation had everything: press briefings, endless resources, manhunts. Ramirez terrorized wealthy white neighborhoods, and the police moved heaven and earth to track him down. But here, in South Central, the victims weren't rich, they weren't white. And according to what Prescott claimed, and rightfully so, about the authorities, that meant they didn't matter. By January 1986, the body count had climbed to 15. Pressure on the LAPD grew. More detectives were assigned to the case. The department, now working with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, also known as LASD, formed what they called the Southside Slayer Task Force. It sounded promising. It sounded serious. But still, there were no arrests, no real progress. So Prescott and her group took matters into their own hands. They formalized their efforts under a new name: the Black Coalition Fighting Back Serial Murders. In March 1986, they forced the Los Angeles City Council to raise the reward for information, doubling it from $10,000 to $25,000. They were relentless. They weren't going to let these women be forgotten. But then, something changed. The evidence wasn't lining up. The patterns, the methods, they weren't the work of just one person. The police had spent years chasing a single serial killer. Now they realized the truth was far worse. There wasn't just one predator in South Central. There were several. 4, maybe more. The LAPD suddenly had a bigger problem. Suddenly, there was an overlapping network of serial killers all operating in the same hunting grounds, taking advantage of the same vulnerable population. By the end of 1986, the Southside Slayer Task Force started to fall apart. The city was spending millions on an investigation with no clear answers, and by the next year, the task force was downsized. The flow of clues had dried up. Leads were going nowhere. Lieutenant John Zorn, one of the task force commanders, admitted it. The flow of clues is almost non-existent at this point. Translation? The police were giving up. The killers were still out there, and the worst one of all, Lonnie Franklin Jr. He was watching, he was waiting, and the monstrosity was just getting started. For years, the murders in South Central had faded into the background, cold cases, forgotten victims, no answers. Even when the LA streets still screamed with violence, the silence of the law enforcement was deafening. But in May 2007, several years later, a breakthrough shattered the silence. A 25-year-old woman, Janisha Peters, was found murdered. And when investigators ran the DNA evidence, they made a shocking discovery. Her killer's genetic profile matched at least 11 other unsolved murders dating back to 1985. The Southside Slayer may have been many people, but this was one man. That same year, the LAPD formed a secret task force that would be called the 800 Task Force. 6 detectives in the robbery-homicide unit worked in silence. They weren't just investigating a serial killer. They were investigating a ghost. Someone who was unseen, yet his mischief was haunting the people of LA. Because for over 2 decades, this predator had gone undetected. He had stopped killing, or so they thought. The killer had vanished without a trace, only to reappear 22 years later. Then, after just 4 months, the secret was out. Investigative journalist Christine Pelisek from LA Weekly blew the case wide open. She exposed the task force's existence, the DNA connection between the old murders and the new one, and, most damning of all, the silence. The city's leaders, Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa and Police Chief William Bratton, had said nothing. No press release, no warning to the public, no acknowledgement that a serial killer had been stalking their streets for over 2 decades, and for some families, the LA Weekly article was the first time they heard the truth. Their daughters hadn't just disappeared. They had been murdered in cold blood years ago. By September 2008, pressure was mounting. Los Angeles officials finally stepped forward, offering a $500,000 reward for information on the killer. But the public still knew little. The case was filled with mystery. Then, on November 1st, 2008, the case was featured on America's Most Wanted. More eyes were on the case now, more pressure, more questions. Finally, in February 2009, Chief Bratton held a press conference. He gave the killer a name, the Grim Sleeper, a nickname chosen by LA Weekly. Why? Because this murderer had done something that most serial killers don't. He had stopped, or at least it seemed that way. From a span of 1988 to 2002, there were no known murders, no bodies linked to his DNA, no clues. He had vanished. And then, in 2002, he struck again. But that wasn't all. Bratton also released a 911 call from the 1980s. A witness had called the police, claiming to have seen a man dumping a body. He gave them a detailed description, even the license plate number of the van involved. A van connected to the now-closed Cosmopolitan Church. The evidence had been there for decades. And yet, the Grim Sleeper had remained free. Then, in March 2009, Pelisek landed an interview with the only known survivor. Her name was Enietra Washington. She described him. A black man in his early 30s, neat, tidy, kind of geeky. He wore a black polo shirt tucked into khaki trousers. He didn't look like a monster, but she had seen his face. She had been inside his car, and she had lived to tell the tale. Now, after decades of silence, the LAPD was closing in. The Grim Sleeper's past was finally catching up to him, and this time he wouldn't disappear. The scariest part was that the police already had his name. They just didn't know it. Back in 2003, Franklin had been convicted of a felony and sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation, a perfect opportunity to collect his DNA, But it never happened. A year later, California passed Proposition 69, a law requiring DNA samples from all felons and those arrested for certain charges. A massive expansion of the state's database. Thousands of samples were collected. Thousands. But Franklin's wasn't one of them. Between November 2004 and August 2005, probation officers failed to collect DNA samples from those on unsupervised probation. They were stretched thin, not enough resources, not enough manpower. And in that tiny loophole, the grim sleeper stayed hidden. By 2010, the LAPD had DNA from multiple crime scenes. They knew their killer's genetic fingerprint, but when they ran it through the system, there was no match. But then they tried something different. Familial DNA analysis. Instead of searching for a perfect match, they looked for relatives, someone in the database who shared enough genetic markers to be closely related to the killer. And that's when they found Christopher Franklin, Lonnie Franklin's son. Christopher had been convicted of a felony weapons charge in 2008. He was too young to be the murderer, but the DNA was close enough to lead detectives straight to his father. Now, they needed proof. An undercover officer was sent to a restaurant where Franklin was eating. His job was to get the killer's DNA. He posed as a waiter, sneakily collecting everything Franklin touched: dishes, silverware, a pizza crust. Back at the lab, they ran the tests. And this time, there was no doubt. It was him. Lonnie Franklin was the murderer. On July 7, 2010, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was arrested. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office charged him with 10 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and a special circumstance allegation for multiple homicides. But the nightmare wasn't over, because when detectives searched his home, they found something far worse than they ever expected. Inside Franklin's house, police found 180 photos of women, some smiling, some looking scared, some unconscious, and that was just the beginning. In total, there were over 1,000 photographs and several hundred hours of video. Women of all ages, teenagers, middle-aged, even older, most of them black, many of them undressed, posed, vulnerable. Some of them were never seen again. The LAPD didn't know if they were victims or survivors, so Chief Charlie Beck made a horrifying statement. "We don't even know if they are victims, but we do know this. Lonnie Franklin's reign of terror spanned over 2 decades, with almost a dozen confirmed murder victims. We need to investigate further." The police released the images to the public, desperate to identify the women before it was too late. And then, in November 2011, another horrifying revelation. Detectives reviewed hundreds of old case files and made a grim discovery. They believed Franklin was responsible for at least 6 more murders. 2 women had gone missing in 2005. Their bodies were never found. 2 more had been discovered in the 80s, and 2 others had been killed in that mysterious 14-year gap between 1988 and 2002, when everyone thought the grim sleeper went dormant. But now, there was no doubt. He never stopped. He had just learned how to hide better. After years of delays, the trial of Lonnie Franklin Jr. finally began on February 16, 2016. It had been a long road to justice, but now the victims' families would finally hear the truth laid out in court. For nearly 3 months, the prosecution presented its case. Then, on May 2nd, the closing arguments began. 2 days later, the jury went into deliberation. It didn't take them long. By May 5th, just a day and a half later, they had their verdict: guilty, on all counts. A week later, at the sentencing hearing, prosecutors dropped another bombshell. They believed there were even more victims. 4 more women, namely Sharon Alicia Dismuke, Inez Warren, Georgia Mae Thomas, and Rolenia Morris, were now suspected to have been killed by Franklin. Sharon Alicia Dismuke was just 21 when she was found lifeless in South Park, Los Angeles, on January 15, 1984. At the time, no one linked her murder to the grim sleeper. It wasn't until Franklin's arrest decades later that investigators saw the bizarre similarities. The way she was killed, the way her body was left behind, it all matched his signature. Then there was Inez Elizabeth Warren. She was 28 when someone shot her on August 15th, in the year 1988. She was still alive when first responders found her in an alley in Gramercy Park, Los Angeles. But by the time she reached the hospital, it was too late. Like Sharon, she wasn't considered a grim sleeper victim at first. That changed when investigators took a second look after Franklin was caught. Alicia Monique Alexander was just 18. She had her whole life ahead of her. But on September 11, 1988, that future was stolen. Her body was found dumped in an alley near 43rd Place and Western Avenue in Vermont Square, Los Angeles. Another young life, brutally ended. Georgia Mae Thomas was different. Her murder came years later during the so-called dormant years when the grim sleeper was supposedly inactive. On December 28th, in the year 2000, she was shot and left for dead in South Park, Los Angeles. And just like the others, her case remained unsolved until Franklin's trial forced investigators to re-examine her death. And then there was Rolenia Adele Morris. She was 31 when she vanished on September 10, 2005. Last seen near the 9,000 block of Southwestern Avenue in Los Angeles, she was never found. But Franklin had something of hers, her Nevada driver's license, and even more disturbingly, 2 explicit photographs of her, buried among the hundreds of other images in his garage. It was the final piece of evidence that tied her disappearance to his decades-long reign of terror. These women weren't just names on a list. They were daughters, sisters, and friends, and for far too long, their cases were ignored. It took years, too many years, to bring their killer to justice. But when the truth finally came out, there was no more hiding. Investigators had pieced together their connections to him only after his arrest, but their cases weren't part of the trial. Prosecutors feared adding them would drag things out even longer. On June 6, 2016, the jury made their final decision. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was sentenced to death. 2 months later, on August 10th, the judge made it official by reading out the names of every victim he was convicted of murdering. And then, just when it seemed like justice had been served, Franklin met an unexpected end. On March 28, 2020, he was found dead in his cell. No signs of trauma. No official cause of death was released to the public. Just like that, the grim sleeper was gone, taking with him whatever secrets he hid in his chest as he waited for his death. It's hard to say exactly when Lonnie Franklin Jr. started killing. Prosecutors think his first victim was Sharon Alicia Dismuke in January 1984, but the first murder they could confirm was Deborah Jackson in August of 1985. She was shot and left lying on the streets like she never mattered. And then there was nothing. For years, it was as if the killer vanished. No bodies, no reports, no trace. But did he really stop? Or was he just getting better at hiding his crimes? That's the question that would haunt investigators for decades. But the truth was, he never really slept. They just hadn't found everyone yet. His last known victim was killed in 2007, and by then, a terrifying pattern had emerged. Almost all of them were black women, many of them sex workers. Easy targets, women that society already overlooked. And Franklin knew that, and he took advantage of it. The bodies were always found outside, dumped in alleys, left to rot near downtown Los Angeles. And every single time, the weapon was the same, a .25 caliber handgun. So how many women did the Grim Sleeper really kill? That's a question we may never fully answer. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you for watching.